Welcome to The Debate. Today, we're opening the file on a narrative that is, well, it's as common as it is devastating. It's about a man the source material calls Mr. John. And this isn't just a story about bad financial planning. It's really a tragedy of good intentions. John spent decades laboring to buy a small apartment, his absolute sanctuary for retirement. But when his son wanted to start a business, John did what so many parents would see as the ultimate act of love. He mortgaged that home to provide the capital.
And it's so crucial to note the twist here. I mean, usually in these stories, the business fails, the money just vanishes, and it's a loss for everyone. But in this case, the son's business actually succeeded. The money flowed in, the son thrived. But the repayment? It just never happened. The son moved up in the world while John ended up, destitute, living in a deteriorating house, unable to afford even basic comforts.
Right. And that image of John living in a cold, uncomfortable house while his son enjoys the fruits of his father's sacrifice, that's really the anchor for our discussion today. We're critically analyzing the financial dynamics between aging parents and their adult children. We're wrestling with a really brutal question that the source material brings up. Is this unconditional financial support a noble, necessary act of parental love, or is it a dangerous vulnerability that threatens the very physical existence of the senior?
It's a heavy question, and it cuts right to the core of family dynamics. You seem to be framing this as a systemic failure of boundaries, a lack of rules. I'm looking at it as more of a complex collision of identity and obligation, and frankly, fear. So the core debate today is really, is self-preservation the highest form of love, or does imposing strict financial boundaries actually undermine the fundamental emotional role of being a parent in your final years?
And I'm taking the position that the source material makes a definitive, almost biological case for self-preservation. The data suggests that without strict financial boundaries, without what we might call financial hygiene, parental love becomes self-destructive. And we aren't just talking about numbers on a screen here. We are talking about tangible, medical, and psychological harm. If you give until you break, you haven't served anyone.
And I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle. While I absolutely acknowledge the financial risks are stark, I think your framework of boundaries and contracts is just too clinical for the messy reality of family life. It ignores the psychological truth that for many seniors, the act of giving it's intrinsically tied to their sense of worth, their utility, and their terrifying fear of isolation. You just can't legislate away the heart's desire to feel needed.
But you can regulate how that need is expressed before it becomes fatal. Let's move beyond Mr. John for a moment, because the source material points to a global pattern. I want to examine the case of Emily and Michael from the United States. This example strikes me as particularly insidious because it wasn't a huge one-time mortgage event like Mr. John's. It was habitual.
Right. This is the small loan dynamic. Michael needed help with a divorce, a crisis, but then it just sort of morphed into monthly requests. It wasn't an explosion, it was a slow leak.
Exactly. It's the death by 1,000 cuts. And look at the specific result described in the text. Emily's retirement fund didn't just dip, it eroded to the point where she could not afford a necessary dental procedure. This is where I take a hard line. I mean, we romanticize sacrifice, but you cannot care for a child if you lack the resources to care for your own body. The source explicitly links this lack of structure to emotional distress, and it cites specific physiological responses, cortisol spikes, and chronic insomnia.
I want to pause on the dental procedure, though, because that's a very visceral detail. It's easy for us to sit here and say, oh, she should have prioritized her teeth, but you have to put yourself in Emily's psychology. The source material highlights a really potent motivator, the fear of losing connection. When a parent is aging, their world often shrinks. So the ability to help to be the savior for their child is a massive dopamine hit. It validates their role. It says, I am still the mother, I am still capable.
But at what cost? We're talking about cortisol, the stress hormone. When that is chronically elevated because you're lying awake at 3 in the morning worrying about your shrinking savings, it destroys your immune system. It exacerbates heart conditions. When a parent prioritizes a child's temporary crisis over their own medical needs, that isn't love. That is a failure of safety. If you're losing sleep to fund your child's lifestyle, your body is keeping the score, even if your heart wants to ignore it.
You call it a failure of safety. Emily probably feels it as a triumph of loyalty, and this is the friction we have to respect. The text mentions social withdrawal as a risk of being exploited, but I'd argue the inverse is also true for the parent who says no. If Emily cuts off Michael to protect her dental fund, okay, she may be protecting her assets, but she risks severing the one tie that makes her feel relevant. The source notes that the desire to remain useful is a key driver for this demographic. If she says no, does the phone stop ringing?
Well, if the phone stops ringing because the checkbook closed, then the relationship was a transaction, not a bond. You were just paying a subscription fee for your son's attention.
That's incredibly cynical.
It's realistic, and frankly, it's the lesson the source material is screaming at us.
I think it's more complex than that. It's not just about paying for attention. It's about the cultural script of parenthood. You spend 40 years being the provider, and to suddenly switch gears and say, my dental work matters more than your divorce, that requires a rewriting of the self that is just incredibly painful. The text warns that withholding help feels like withholding affection. So this debate isn't just about the math, it's about the terrifying prospect of irrelevance.
I understand the desire to remain useful, I do, but we have to distinguish between being useful and being used. The text is warning us about the difference between healthy support and financial enmeshment. And enmeshment is where the boundaries between the parent's needs and the child's wants just dissolve. If Emily is losing sleep, literally suffering from insomnia because of Michael's divorce bills, that is a biological red flag.
It is a red flag, sure. But let's look at the alternative. If she keeps the money and fixes her teeth, but Michael crashes and burns, she carries the guilt. And that guilt can be just as corrosive as the cortisol.
See, I'm not convinced by that, because it creates this false dichotomy where the parent has to be the martyr to avoid guilt. Let's move to the second major point here, the definition of harm. You're suggesting that the emotional harm of saying no, the guilt, the potential loneliness is comparable to the physical harm of saying yes? I have to look at the evidence provided about James and Edward in the UK. This case study is critical.
James co-signed the loan for the cafe. Yes.
Right. James co-signed. The business went well. But Edward the son treated the repayment as optional. Now look at the physical toll on James described in the text. High blood pressure, chronic stress, a disappearing sense of security. Or look at Mia in New Zealand, who paid university fees for her granddaughter, but then couldn't afford physiotherapy for herself. The physical body doesn't care about good intentions. It doesn't care about your desire to remain useful. If generosity leads to skipped medication or untreated illness or hypertension, the behavior is objectively harmful. We cannot prioritize the psychological feeling of connection over the biological reality of survival.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that we can separate the two so cleanly, especially not in this demographic. You're focusing so heavily on the physical toll, which is valid. I mean, high blood pressure is real, but the source also lists loss of dignity as a primary risk. Dignity is an existential concept.
But the loss of dignity stems from the financial loss. It comes from having to live in a cold house like Mr. John, or being unable to walk properly like Mia.
I disagree. I think the loss of dignity stems from the betrayal of the dynamic. Let's look at James again. The stress James felt wasn't just because his bank balance was low. It was the dissonance. The source talks about misunderstood love. James expected gratitude. He expected a reciprocal exchange. I help you start your life, you help me end mine gracefully. Instead, he got neglect. The harm comes from the shattered expectation, not just the missing money. If James had lost that money in the stock market crash, he'd be stressed, sure, but he wouldn't feel the same loss of dignity that he felt being ignored by his son.
That brings us directly to the concept of dependency and the intergenerational contract. You talk about shattered expectations, but I argue that the lack of clear, hard boundaries is exactly what shatters them. The text makes a fascinating point that I really want to drill into. When older adults protect their security, children develop responsibility and manage their own finances.
In an ideal world, maybe.
It's not about idealism, it's about pedagogical structure. Go back to Mr. John. The tragedy there wasn't just that the son was a bad actor. It was that the arrangement had no guardrails.
The lack of a written plan or a maximum amount that enabled the son's negligence. The source states that unconditional support creates a situation where gratitude fades and entitlement just rises. By failing to set a boundary, Mr. John actually participated in destroying the character of his son. The son learned he could take without consequence. So unconditional support doesn't just hurt the parent, it stunts the child.
That is a compelling argument, and logically, I do agree that boundaries help development. But I want to push back on the implementation. You're blaming the lack of a written plan for Mr. John's tragedy. You're saying if he had a contract, this wouldn't have happened. I would argue the issue wasn't the giving, it was the breach of the implied covenant of care.
But a written plan would have codified that covenant. It removes the ambiguity. It puts the covenant on paper so it can't be misunderstood.
Or it would have alienated the son immediately. The source mentions that James in the UK felt guilty asking for repayment because he was afraid of appearing calculating. And this is a massive psychological barrier. In many cultures and in many families, introducing a contract into a relationship, it feels cold, it feels transactional. It violates the warmth of the family bond. You're expecting parents to act like banks. And while that's logically sound for asset protection, I have to point out that enforcing those boundaries requires overcoming these deep-seated instincts of guilt. Mr. John didn't fail because he didn't have a contract. He failed because he trusted a bond that his son had already abandoned.
But that is exactly why the calculating approach is necessary, because human beings are fallible. Even children we love, especially children we love. If James had been calculating, he might have seemed cold in the moment, but he wouldn't have high blood pressure and a threatened retirement today. We have to stop treating calculating as a dirty word. It's simply clarity. It's respect for one's own future.
Clarity is one thing. Treating your child like a business partner is another. It changes the texture of the love.
But if money is changing hands, it is a business transaction, whether you call it one or not. If you mortgage your house, the bank treats it as a business transaction. If you don't treat the loan to your son with the same seriousness, you are the only one exposing yourself to risk. Which leads me to the practical solutions the source advocates for, which I think are frankly non-negotiable for safe aging.
You're referring to the section called Healthy Love Must Include Healthy Limits.
Yes, the text is very clear on 3 pillars. First, prioritizing your own medical and personal needs. Second, clearly distinguishing gifts versus loans. And third, keeping a written plan for large transactions. There's a line in the text that just summarizes my entire position. True love honors both generosity and self-preservation. If the parent ends up in a deteriorating, uncomfortable old house like Mr. John did, they become a burden to the very children they tried to help. So by refusing to set boundaries today, you're guaranteeing you will be
A liability tomorrow. I get it. I do. But I question the implementation of these safe boundaries in the real world, particularly the written plan. Your solution works when we're sitting here calmly discussing it. But what about the edge case?
Define the edge case.
The crisis. The emotional emergency. The source mentions Emily's son Michael going through a divorce. That is a moment of high emotional volatility. If the choice is Emily gets her dental work or Michael gets help so he doesn't lose his apartment and access to his kids, the parent will almost always choose the child. And why? Because of that fear of losing connection. Your solution requires a level of emotional detachment, a triumph of logic over emotion that contradicts the source's own admission that seniors derive their self-worth from being the safety net.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. It's not about detaching from the child. It's about reframing what help actually means. If Emily gives the money and then her health collapses, she has simply shifted the crisis from Michael to herself. Now Michael has a divorced life and a sick mother to care for.
But in the moment, she feels like a hero. She feels needed. And that feeling is intoxicating when you're 75 and society largely ignores you.
And that feeling is a trap. That is the misunderstood love the text warns about. It's a dopamine hit of validation that costs her long-term security. It is short-term gain for long-term pain.
I think we're circling the central tragedy here. You see the tragedy as the loss of the funds. I see the tragedy as the exploitation of a natural human impulse.
I see the tragedy as preventable. That's the difference. The source is explicitly telling us that these stories, John, Emily, James, Mia, they're cautionary tales. They are not inevitable acts of God. They happened because the parents believed that love meant no limits. They believed that to be a good parent, the wallet just had to be open.
And the children allowed them, or maybe encouraged them to believe that.
Correct. Which is why the parent who holds the assets must be the one to draw the line. The text explicitly says, when older adults protect their financial security, children learn to respect their parents' limits. It's a pedagogical moment. If you never say no, the child never learns the value of the yes. If the bank of mom and dad is always open, the child never learns to build their own equity.
But I see the lesson differently. I think the text suggests that families thrive when there is clarity, yes, but that clarity doesn't always have to be a written contract or a hard no. It can be an honest conversation about capacity. I can give this much and no more. But even that conversation is incredibly difficult when the guilt and obligation mentioned in the source is at play. It requires the parent to admit vulnerability, to say, I'm not an endless well.
Which is frightening.
It's terrifying, because if you admit you aren't an endless well, you have to admit you're aging. You have to admit you are finite. And that brings us right back to the desire to remain useful. You frame this desire as a vulnerability that predators, even unintentional ones like Michael or Edward, can exploit.
Because it is. If your self-worth is tied to your wallet opening, you are in a very precarious position. You are essentially telling the world, I only matter if I pay.
That is a harsh way to put it, but I can't deny the text supports that view. It says emotional motives cannot override practical safety.
Exactly. Practical safety is the floor. Everything else is the ceiling. You cannot build a relationship on a floor that has collapsed. If you're Mia in New Zealand and you can't walk properly because you skipped physio to pay for university fees, you are physically unable to enjoy the relationship you just paid for. You can't visit your granddaughter at university if you can't walk to the car.
And yet, if you build a fortress of safety so high that your children feel judged or rejected like James feared he might, you can end up safe, rich, and alone. That is the tension we just cannot fully resolve. You're saying secure your mask first, but I'm saying don't let the mask hide your face.
I would argue that a child who rejects you because you prioritized your health over their business venture is not a child providing the peaceful, stable, and dignified life we're all aiming for. That is a transactional relationship disguised as love.
Perhaps, but familial love is rarely that rational. We endure transactional phases because we hope for transformation. Mr. John hoped his son would step up. He bet his house on that hope.
And he lost. He lost everything.
He did. And that loss is what we're trying to help our listeners avoid. But we have to acknowledge that for John, in that moment of signing the mortgage, he probably felt like the best father in the world.
And that is the seductive danger of it. We're nearing the end of our time, and we should probably wrap this up.
Financial risks are undeniably real. We can't ignore that for many seniors, money is the only tool they feel they have left to maintain a bond. The real trap described in the text is misunderstood love, giving with the hope of return rather than the certainty of safety. We have to have empathy for why they give, even as we acknowledge the danger. We can't just scold them for bad math. We have to address the lonely heart behind the checkbook.
And I will reassert that love without boundaries becomes a burden, not support. The tragic stories of John, Emily, James, and Mia all stem from the same fundamental error: prioritizing the child's temporary want over the parent's permanent need. The source is clear. Families thrive when generosity is balanced with responsibility. You cannot be a pillar for your family if you've allowed yourself to crumble. The most loving thing you can do for your child is to ensure you never become a burden to them.
It seems we do agree that the goal is a peaceful, stable life, even if we disagree on the difficulty of the path to actually get there.
Indeed. And whether that's achieved through strict financial fortresses or risking it all for relational trust is something our listeners will have to decide for themselves.
Families thrive when generosity is balanced with clarity. I think that's a sentiment we can both stand behind.
Thank you for listening to The Debate.